Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Lee, lead admin evangelist at Salesforce, and let's get interactive. So go into the chat and tell me where you are watching us from. And I see that George is viewing us from Argentina. So hello, George. If this is your first episode of Automate This, it is a monthly series showcasing trailblazers like you doing some amazing things with automation. And if you're a returning viewer, welcome back. So a lot of times when we're thinking about automation, we're looking to automate to increase productivity for our end users, for data entry, updating records, etc. But have you considered using automation to streamline operations, such as testing automation? So check out this episode where we will use Flow Builder to do just that. And the best part to be reminded when we live stream is to set the reminder on the live stream episode page. Then you'll get an email reminder the day of the event. And to interact during the live stream, post your comments in the chat. Interact with other viewers, and to engage me and my guest presenters, start your question with a Q colon so that we can quickly scan through, identify, and answer your questions during the Q&A portion of this episode. So here's what you will learn in today's episode from our presenter, Nancy Brown. You'll learn how to use subflows with scheduled flows, how to eliminate a get records element by using the record ID to get the entire record, and how to create streamlined approach when testing scheduled flows. So I'm excited to be joined today with Nancy Brown. So Seth Khalid was scheduled to be on, but he is unable to attend due to a personal matter. So Seth, we send our love, and we'll have you on Automate This at a later date. So have you ever encountered issues having your users testing scheduled flows? Well, Nancy will show us how she created a way for her client to easily test scheduled flows in lieu of waiting for that scheduled flow time. So welcome to Automate This, Nancy. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Great. So before we dive into the demo, learning about your use case, share with us how you got started with Flow Builder.
Well, since being in the ecosystem since 2018, I've always interested in learning new things and automations, and there's always information about learning flows, and I'm the person that wants to keep up on new innovations and stuff like that. So I've always adopted flows and continue to try to stay on top of the new features when they come out.
Great. So with all this AI talk happening, how have you seen AI impacting your ability to create automation?
Well, for one thing, I use automation sometimes to help me with creating formulas. One thing that we have so many resources to get information from. AI is just another tool. If I need to create a formula that, or even dissect a formula that I need information on, I may use AI to break it down for me.
Great. All right. So, Nancy, share with us your use case and show us how you built it.
Oh, okay. Well, in a previous group I was on, we had a client that wanted email alerts going out when their time cards were overdue, or either there were reminders when time cards were overdue, and if time cards had been seriously overdue. So that's a simple task, create scheduled flows to make that happen. But when it comes to user acceptance testing scheduled flows, everyone who has had experience doing them knows that you set it up to run at a specific time, and then that's fine. But what if the people who are testing the functionality before it goes into production, if their scheduling does not fit well with when the scheduled flow is supposed to run, then you kind of have a disconnect. So, what I decided to do was take the processing that was in the scheduled flow and put it in a subflow, and then utilize a screen flow that would enable the user to initiate the test when they wanted to run it. So that's kind of where I started at. It was very easy to put together. And let me preface this by saying this is kind of a scaled down version of the solution that I created, which was in the client's production org. I just kind of replicated a form of it in my developer org for demonstration purposes. So I had mentioned that like the client had time cards. Of course, those of us who work know that you sometimes get reminders if you haven't done your time card on time. um, Maybe you get reminders leading up to it or after or what have you. So this is the simple time card record, and there are email alert dates that are on the time card record based on the week ending date. And there are three different types of separate email alerts that go out. And the formula field is what drives the scheduled flow. So, for example, the submit reminder formula is based on this week ending date. And so you take the week ending date and you subtract 2 in the formula for that one. For the unsubmitted reminder, you take the week ending date and you add 2. And for the beginning of the month, it looks at the week ending date and it decides what is the first day of the following month. So if you've got your time card due that late, then they definitely need to get it done, because they're going to need to do billing for the prior month. So they want to get all of the time cards in. Now, the reason why this week ending date is something that is not real easily manipulated is because it is coming out of this particular object, the time card periods object. And there are validations that kind of restrict changing or creating records in it, which of course us as system admins can get around that. But I didn't really want to fool with manipulating that record. So you can kind of think of this as a constant. So you can see that, the running the tests for this would span over a large amount of time. When you have like a 2 or 3 day user acceptance test period, that's not going to work. So let's see. So what I did was, this is just an example of the original scheduled flow, and there's 3 different ones, one for each of those different email alert types. I created those scheduled flows. And for those of you who may not have worked with scheduled flows, let me just break down a little bit about them. Um, what you have over here on the right, we can see, oops, I was just where I want it to be. Sorry about that. If I go over here, when you create a scheduled flow, you're going to give it three main pieces of information. Of course, when do you want it to start running? And then you want to also indicate the time that you want that scheduled flow to run. And if you look at the help text, it reminds you that the start date and time is based on your org's time zone. And then also you indicate the frequency. So in this case, this scheduled flow is going to run on a daily basis. Now, back to the start time, things that you want to look at with regard to that is what is your org setup in terms of the default time zone. That is what will drive when the scheduled flow real one sorry will run. However, you can, once you set up and activate a scheduled flow, you can check and see and validate that it's been set up correctly by going to scheduled jobs in setup. You can see that it shows me here that this scheduled flow is the next run is going to be tomorrow, the 27th at 5 a.m. And you may say, well, wait a minute. When I looked at it, it said 6 a.m. And that's because in the scheduled jobs page, it shows you what time it runs based on your personal time zone that you may have set in your own settings. So in my case, just to demonstrate that, I set my language and my time zone to Central Standard Time. That's why in the scheduled section here, it shows that it's going to run at 5 a.m. So sometimes that can throw you off a little bit, but just keep that in mind when you're building a scheduled flow. So for this additional items on this scheduled flow, what I decided to do was have a decision element, and each one of them is slightly different because this is the one for the reminder email alert. So it's going to look at that one formula field for the reminder, and it's going to calculate, is that date equal to today's date? So based on the example, I know those are past dates, but those were in May. This one would not run and trigger sending any reminders for that particular record because, of course, that date has changed. But let's say, for example, if the date we were using, if the formula did equate to the current date, the decision element, it would come and actually run this send email action, which would actually send out the email alert. And so what we're sending here is the body that I have defined in the flow using a text template. Very simple notice there. And then also it would use the email that's coming from the time card record. And then also I hard coded in the subject for that particular email alert. And so the other two are the same. It's just that it's looking at the different formula field that I showed on the time card record. So that's where we're at. I had those flows built, and then I decided, well, it's going to be cumbersome for me to coordinate with the person who's testing. I'm going to need to set it up at a specific time and all of this and that. So what I decided to do was extract the send email reminders out of each of those separate scheduled flows and build them out in a subflow. Okay, so some of you might not be familiar with subflows, and I'm really getting to like them quite a lot. But you might consider a subflow as a child flow to a parent flow. So my scheduled flow is my parent flow, and the subflow is the child flow. Now, the only distinction about that is you really have to build out the subflow and activate that before you can allow the parent flow to call it. So let's look at this subflow in more detail. Again, very simple concept, but I like to look at this as a concept for using scheduled flows. You could have some really heavy duty processing in your schedule flow, you could give consideration to pulling it out and putting it in a subflow. So this is really just for demonstration purposes. So I have, when building your subflow, you have to have a means of the parent flow communicating or passing information to the subflow. And you do that by the way of creating variables where you're going to pass data from one to the other. So in this case, the parent flow is going to have a variable, and I'll show you when we look back at the reformatted flow where I actually changed it to call the subflow. I'll show you what I'm talking about. But in the child flow, I needed to set up a variable that will accept the email alert value. Now, that's going to be some indicators indicating whether it's a reminder, an unsubmitted email type, or beginning of the month. So I have one variable set up for that. One key thing about that is you do need to set this available for input that allows it to receive the information from the parent flow. So I have one for that email alert, and actually these are the ones that we just mentioned. I also have a input variable that I created for a recipient, and this isn't really applicable for the scheduled flow. I'll get into why this is created in a little bit. But again, you have to have the available for input. And then the other one, a schedule flow is getting in the different records of that whatever object that scheduled flow is processing. So you need to pass the record that qualifies into the subflow so that it can send out the email alert for that particular person. So again, you've got to have the available for input, and you're passing that record from the scheduled flow. And then, of course, the decision element is going to look at that email alert type and decide which path it's going to go down. I've got one for each one. And just like you saw in the scheduled flow, I put the send email action into the subflow. And I have a different email, or I should say template, for the respective email alerts. And I have a couple of other elements, like, for example, for the recipient, and this is the one I'm going to get back to, so let me close that up. For the subject, I'm using a case element to look at that email alert type to decide what subject I'm going to use in the email that's going out. And since I've been holding off on that recipient, I'll give a preview about that. We are going to look at the specific alternative way of testing that I created, and that's via a screen flow. When we look at that and we'll walk through those steps, you'll see that the tester will be able to enter in an email that they want the email alert to go to. That is because the default is to send the time card notice to the employee on the time card record. But you don't want it to go to them because the tester wants to receive the email so they can validate that the email is formatted correctly. So that's why this recipient formula is used. If it receives a recipient sent from that time card, the screen flow from the I'm sorry, this from the screen flow, that subflow initiated, it will send the recipient email. Otherwise, it'll default to the email that's on the time card record. That's why that's there. And then let's see, I already brought up about the subject and using a case for that. Let's see. So that's pretty much how the new subflow is created. And so what I needed to do, going back to that original flow, Remember, it had the action directly in that flow. What I did to save time, now again, this is a very quick flow, so you could definitely create it for scratch. But what I do sometimes, if I've built a flow and I decided later on I want to either change it to a different type of flow or I want to change it to a subflow, I might do a save as and do new flow and then go down here and I can change the type of flow. So in this case, I would have changed this scheduled flow to an auto launch flow and rename it and all of that. Now, when you do that, that is likely to create errors in that newly created flow. And that's because your schedule flow would have processed $ record variables, and that doesn't exist in the auto launch flow. But sometimes, if the flow that you're converting, maybe you've built out a lot of variables and you've already got a lot of code in it, it might be quicker to fix the errors that arise when you do a save as rather than starting from scratch. So you can play around with that and see if that works for you sometimes. But in the revise flow, all I did was, let's see, and that is not the revised flow. Here's the revised flow. Okay. So in the revised flow, all I did was I took out the send email action and I replaced it with this subflow node. Everything else was pretty much the same. And opening up the subflow node, you can see that, let's see, remember the variables that we talked about in the subflow? Well, this parent flow is going to tell it which um, resources from this flow it's going to pass to the subflow. So in this case, it's going to send a reminder because this is the scheduled flow for the reminder email alert. And it's going to send the time card record that the scheduled flow was processing. It's going to send that information to the subflow, and voila, all your work is done for you at that point. So now that's one piece of the puzzle. One of the main reasons why I did this, again, was because I wanted to create an easy way for my testers to be able to generate the email so they could validate if the email was formatted properly. So here is the time card record that we looked at earlier. And right up here in the right is a test email alert button. And so when you click on this button, it opens up a screen where the user can indicate which email alert they want to generate, and then they can put in that email. Remember, I mentioned the email that they can put in so that they can override the default email on the time card record, and then they can submit the test. Okay, before we'll actually run that, I wanted to talk a little bit about action buttons, which to me are so cool. They're fairly easy to create. You want to go to Object Manager for the object where you want the button to appear, and you can come down and click on buttons, links, and actions. And in this case, I did new action. And actually, I'm going to open up the one that we saw on the record. You go in and you name, of course, the button. You indicate which flow you're going to initiate when clicking this button. Now, one thing I didn't mention, let me go back here and show you. If I did one from scratch, you come in here and you can indicate which type of action type button. So in this case, I said flow. And so that's where you indicate that this particular one needs to trigger the time card notification test screen flow. Now, one tip to remember, if you do not see your flow that you want listed, it's probably because the flow isn't activated. And that actually was another thing I meant to mention when we were looking at subflows. When I we saw the window where we had the subflow on the right panel, you click and you actually, let me go back here because I think this is an important thing because it's happened to me more than once. Um, in the version of the flow, the revised flow, and where is it? When you're selecting your flow in this subflow component, when you're searching for it, if you don't see it, again, it's another thing indicator for you that the flow isn't active. Now, in this case, I see my flow is there, but if it had not shown up, that's the first thing I check. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. Okay, so again, this particular screen flow, very simplistic. It's generating or calling the exact same subflow that we saw with the three different paths. The difference here, I am sending it the email alert, and actually the email alert is coming from what people selected on the screen. We'll look at that in a minute, and also the email that they selected, and it's passing the record. Let's go back to the screen itself and break that down. So here's the simple screen, and I've got radio buttons, and I've got them configured with the different choices. And those choices have that variable that the subflow is looking for to determine which particular email alert it's going to send. And then here's the field for the email that the person is going to pass. So that's what the screen looks like. And we were just looking at this. One thing I wanted to point out, and this is really cool. If you haven't used this yet, this is really cool. We've learned how to use record ID, that specific variable, to be able to pass in an 18-digit record ID into a flow. Well, I think maybe, I don't know how long ago, I learned that you can actually pass in the entire record. And you do that by defining this variable as a data type of record rather than text. And then you indicate which object it is. And then, of course, the available for input. So once you do that, bam, you get the entire record in. What it does for me is in the subflow, or even in this flow, I don't have to do a get record to get that record because it's already going to send the record that I'm on where the action button is on the screen flow. So that's really worth mentioning. If you haven't used that before, it's really cool. So that's what the interior of this subflow looks like. It's just kind of a replica. One other thing I might mention, if you have ever used the email element component on a screen, just remember to use the email value. That's the particular variable that you want to utilize to get that email. So here's our subflow. Now let's go through the actual action itself. And let's see, let's put in okay, email sent. Now let me go to my email engine and see if I get the email. And here we go. I'm using, let's see, sorry about that. And I don't see the email, but when you know it, I do see a version of it when I test with it previously. So I'm not sure why it didn't come through this time, but this is what the very simple email looks like. So, with that said, this allowed my UAT tester to have more flexibility. Now, this button gets removed when this gets moved to production, of course. And other things that I certainly would do is validate when I set up the schedule flows in production. I would validate that looking in the scheduled jobs, I would validate that the times are looking properly. And then I also kind of keep an eye on it in production just to kind of confirm that it runs properly. So that's just a workaround for testing purposes. But it seems to have helped us with utilizing that. And, it's just something you could think about using for more complex code as well. So, with that said, back to you, Jen.
Great, Nancy. I love this really creative solution. I know when I was the admin, it was hard to test flows. I mean, you had to either wait for whatever that time was to pass and then test it. But this is really creative, and I love that the end user can do that testing without having to bother you to change the scenarios and all that. And I love all those little tips that you dropped along the way, things that you learned as you were building out flows and things like that. So, and particularly I love
Yeah,
subflows because you can reuse them over and over again and manage them once and again, reuse them all over. So thanks for that.
right. And
And
and like what you were saying with the scheduled flow, if your processing is outside of the scheduled flow, sometimes if it's more complex code, you're testing and debugging, and with a schedule flow, you have to go and change the time for it to run again. But when it's, extracted and then the subflow, you can control it better as you're developing and building out the solution.
And I love the piece where you added the email piece so it doesn't go to who the intended person is on the record. Goes to the actual tester to validate. So that's good. It's the little things. All right. So as we transition to the Q&A portion, again, just a reminder to ask your questions, starting with a Q colon, so that we can easily identify them. All right, so while we wait for folks to ask questions, I do want to give a shout out to our viewers, to Virginia, people viewing from Virginia, to Minneapolis, Minnesota. I will be there next month at Midwest Streaming. So if you're going to Midwest Streaming, or you can still register to go to that, I will be the opening keynote for their 10th anniversary. So that was the first community dreaming events, and now they're all over. So that's just huge. And I give shout out to Oregon and Nigeria. So thanks for joining us on Automate This. So while we're waiting for questions, gosh, people, there should be questions out there. um, but let's find out for you, Nancy. What would you say is your favorite flow feature that you just
Oh
love?
man, that's well, I would say that, the functionality just continues to get better and better. So it just makes it easier to use the flow. Favorite? Oh man, that's hard. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Man, you stumped me there. But I would say, from the beginning when I first got introduced to flows, you've been a Flownatic for quite some time. So you saw when it was, you had to, define everything and you had to do a lot more,
gosh.
instruction and all of that to run flows. I'd say we've got it so much easier now in terms of they're making it a lot better. What I am interested in and just need to carve out some time is to, introduce myself to the new action that Adam White talked
Oh, the
about in a
action
recent
button.
Automate Sales. Yes, and also some of the reactivity. I want to get more into that when I carve out some time.
Yeah, so for the viewers out there who might not know what Nancy is referring to, so we're talking about screen flow. So what Nancy was focusing on mostly here, but you did see a little small component of screen flows, is it's it's been night and day from where screen flows used to be to now where they are with reactivity. So reactivity is when you're on a screen flow and the user makes a change to something. Like let's say they're selecting something in a pick list, and all of a sudden, because they selected something in that pick list, something else happens in the screen. So different components are reactive to actions are taken on that same screen. Um, and the action button that Nancy mentioned is new to summer 24. It's in beta. And what it does is in that same screen, you click on an action button that then invokes an auto launch flow that ultimately does magical things, but ultimately brings back data back into that same screen flow. So an example of an action button situation could be that you select a contact and then it goes and pulls all the open cases, all the opportunities, and then it brings back and shows it in a data table for the user then to select that case or the opportunity, then further do things with it. So those are just examples of it. But we did have Adam White and Sam Raynard. They are the product managers of ScreenFlow on last month's Automate This. So if you go to our Automate This playlist on the Salesforce Admins YouTube channel, you'll be able to watch the recording of that.
Yeah, it really reduces the amount of, next buttons for your screen. Used to have to do something and then do some other processing and then return another screen. But with this new functionality, you can just pretty much stay on the same screen, present it to the user. Much better end user experience.
Yeah, I mean, you ultimately cut down on the number of screens. Like back in the day, you could have 10 screens to do something that you could potentially have just two. And
Hmm.
it does decrease user frustration and having to hit next, or remember, hey, what did I do on that previous screen that then led to this? And I don't want this, so now I have to go back. So yeah, it's night and day from what it used to be. All right, so I do have a question. So let's pull that in here. Okay, so the question is from Bruno. Thanks for asking the question. Does the record ID variable need a specific spelling to correctly get the record ID? Great question, Bruno. Nancy?
Yes, it does. It does need to be record, um, uppercase I and then D. Just like you use it for the, pulling in the text, the 18-digit ID, if you've ever used it that way, it does you need to have that specific spelling. And then the other difference was changing the data type from text to record and then indicating which object you want brought in. Yeah. So I don't know where that came from, but I just kind of stumbled on it at one point, and then, wow, that's pretty cool.
I don't think that we really publicize it that much, but yeah, it's one of those like magical things. Like once you know it, it opens doors and you don't have to, send a text variable and then does a get record, and then you have to do a get record to get that information and all that. So really these little like gems that they introduce are awesome. Okay. All right, I don't have a question. question, but I want to say Susanna says thanks, Nancy, for the info and for
You're
sharing.
welcome.
And we have another compliment too. That's all the great explanation that you put in, that no one has any questions. This is a first. So while we wait, and folks, if you have general automation questions, we will entertain those as well. Nancy, what are some cool automation things that you have built that you're particularly proud
Well, I love data tables, so I've used them quite a bit. I've pulled in, from a list view, pulled in, once you select a bunch of records from a list view, I've pulled them into a flow and, pulled those record IDs and then processed them in. Let's see. Of course, screen flows. I love them. I've used them in Experience Cloud sites for setting up users and stuff like that, onboarding users. Let's see. So in B2B commerce, I've used flows. Anywhere I can, I use flows. Working on a project now that is using quite a lot of Apex code, and we're just evaluating and seeing where it makes sense to swap out the Apex code with flows. So makes it more maintainable going forward. So we're currently in evaluating that right now.
So when you bring that up, so we know that folks can do things many ways in Salesforce, whether it's declarative or with code. So like how would you recommend admins go about that, figuring out like how do they determine whether when you have a case for automation, whether you go the flow route or you go Apex instead? Like, are there any um, decision trees that go through
Well,
your head before you come to that decision?
Well, I know you have to be considerate of not exceeding limits
Hmm.
um, in processing and flows. So, what I like to do is definitely consult with if I have an potential solution and I'm not really sure, reach out to your dev resources and, explain it to them and just kind of work together to decide what's going to be the most efficient means of delivering that solution. So I definitely wouldn't make the decision when I'm in doubt in a vacuum. I call other resources.
Right.
And there are cases, and I can't tell you right off the top of my head a case, but there are situations where code is definitely warranted. But I think with as flow functionality continues to evolve, things that might have needed to go in Apex direction previously, now is could be a good candidate for flows going forward.
Right. And when I was a customer, we would always, so for these use cases for automation, we would think, okay, first use out of the box Salesforce platform, right? And then you tell me why you have to use code. Like make the case for why it has to go that way. Because now that, like you said, nowadays you could start Flow and then call Apex as for that additional
Mm.
power if you need, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be all code. And I know back in the day, we built like everything on Apex in the very beginnings of Visual Flow Designer, which now is Flow Builder. Um, but yeah, I had to get folks out of the mindset like, oh, I could build anything in code, right? But does it make sense to do so? And um, there are things that admins can build now that you don't need that developer to build in code, and they could focus on like the more complex things. So
Mhm.
and there are times where
Right.
flow isn't the answer, right? When you're hitting things like limits or you're doing something really, really complex or with a lot of, again, record.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there's a
exactly.
time and place for the solutions, and one is better than the other in some cases.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, we have such a quiet crowd today. What's going on? It must be the summer. Um, so let's close it out. For those, Nancy, who are learning flow, what would you recommend as resources?
Well, definitely going to give you a plug. I'd say bookmark, automate this, go back and look at, previous ones, um, Trailhead, and, certainly Salesforce help. But, I also use Google University too. I go out and search and find things, but there's just so much material out there. That was really what drove me to Salesforce in the first part, because I'd always been in IT and I wanted to dip my toe into something else, but found out about Salesforce, and the amount of material out there for learning is just phenomenal. So I would say do that. And then also, if you're in an organization that maybe somebody who uses flows. Maybe you could get a chance to look at some of the flows that they've developed. Or we actually at Coastal, we have a group, a Google chat group, and it's called Flow a Friend.
I love that.
And so if you're stuck with something, maybe you're having a problem with somebody, we drop it in the chat, and people are so helpful with giving solutions, or we shall share different information. We learn about something new. And I would say don't steer away from reading the release notes too, because you want to learn and see things that you might not ordinarily run into, and it's some functionality that you might really be able to use and improve the solutions that you deliver. So definitely keep a lookout for what's up and coming, and practice. Just practice. You got a developer org. Hey,
Hmm.
you can make whatever mistakes you want and just correct it and keep it going. So
Yeah, when you mentioned developer org, I'm a person who likes to get hands on. Like that's the easiest way for it to like cement in my brain, right? So I'll read something. You can read as much as you want, but until you actually get into it, it's not going to stick, right? So for me, what helped me when I was learning flow is I'll read through, watch a video or read a blog, and then I'll go through and actually follow along. So Trailhead is a great way to do that. You could do like Trailhead projects to follow along, but then
mhm.
um, get that developer org, that Trailhead playground, and then build something that take something personal from your own life, right? And automate that, right? Automate the recording. I've seen people automate tracking their blood pressure, right? Take something that isn't work related and just play around with it. And then once you build those things and you're finding that first Salesforce job, right? Bring your dev org up during your interview and be like, let me show you how I did this. And this is like that's a testimonial to what you can do with the tool itself. So all right.
Yeah.
So let's recap what we learned from this episode from Nancy. So we learned how to use those subflows in our scheduled flows, how to eliminate that get records element using that record ID to get that entire record, not just the text ID, and how to create streamlined approach for testing those scheduled flows with your users. And join us next month on July 10th, and we're going to show you how AI can help you in your automation building with Einstein for Flow, which is currently in open beta in summer 24. So I will be joined by a trailblazer, Eduardo Guzman, who will show you how he used Einstein for Flow at Pittman to get a head start on automation creation. And then our Salesforce product manager, Connor Turco, will show us how Einstein will share with us the Einstein for Flow roadmap and answer any of your questions that you may have about Einstein for Flow. So set the reminder on the live stream page now by using the short URL that you see on the screen and be reminded later. And subscribe to our Salesforce Admins YouTube channel so that you can be aware of our new content for the series. All right, so now it's your turn. So here are 3 things that you can do after you watch this episode. So read the Create a Quick Action for Flow help article. Check out the Run a Flow within a Flow Trailhead unit, and read the Schedule a Flow Trailhead unit. And I'm going to give a shout out to my other series on our YouTube channel called How I Solved It, where we take one business problem and show how one awesome admin chose to solve it. So we dropped some episodes so far. You'll see here Carrie Webster, who was our first presenter on our relaunch. We have Eric Mall, Kim Strauss, Brandon Walton, who worked with puppies, and Dan Faulkner, who was this month's How I Solved It. So check out the playlist to watch their episode and past ones. And get great content produced for you admins. Visit our website, admin.salesforce.com, to find the latest blogs, podcasts, and videos. Listen to the Salesforce Admins podcast hosted by Mike Gerholt via all the places that you get your podcast material. And again, watch past episodes of Automate This via our playlist on the Salesforce Admins YouTube channel. And I'd like to thank so much for Nancy for being my guest on Automate This and for all her little gems.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And I want to thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Automate This. I look forward to seeing you at future sessions. Now remember, the best way to be notified when we live stream is to set the reminder on the live stream page, and you get an email reminder on the day of the event. And we'll post all our information on our various social channels. So follow us on X at Salesforce Admins, NoI, LinkedIn, and the Trailblazer community. And we'll see you next time.